May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 11 of season 3. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This episode, the very latest in global podcasting trends and what it all means for brands, from our friend of the show, Omny Studio's Managing Director, Sharon Taylor. But first, my co-host again this episode is Nicole Goodman. Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Nick. Super excited that Sharon has found the time to join us today. Hey, Sharon.
Hello.
Now, straight to it, because you're a very busy person.
That's what I want everyone to think, yes.
Omny Studio was recently acquired by Triton Digital. Well done.
Well
Thank
done.
you.
Round of applause.
Thank you, very exciting.
Now, for those of our listeners who don't know who Triton are, can you explain?
Yep, so Triton Digital are a global provider of audio streaming, podcasting, measurement and ancillary services. So they've been around for, longer than Omny Studio, at least a dozen years. And they provide audio services to radio, to podcasters, to anyone that is out there doing the best they can in audio.
And they've bought Omny Studio, which they've described as the creators of the world's most advanced podcast and on-demand audio publishing platform.
I could not have put it better myself.
That's why I said it for you.
Thank you.
So what does it all mean now that Omny and Triton have teamed up? Again, for our listeners, can you tell us what it means for podcasters, what it means for the industry?
Yeah, I think the industry is probably easier to start with. I think there's been a lot of money flowing into the space and there's been a lot of investments, a lot of acquisitions. I think that will continue in the next 12 months. And I think that we are a dot point on a map proving that there is money to be made in podcasting and that it's a business that other bigger media agencies want to be involved in. And so if that can be our gift to the industry to prove that there is value there, then that's amazing that we've been able to do that. As for what it means for Omny Studio clients, so obviously Triton Digital makes some of the best podcast and streaming ad insertion technology out there. So the next goal for us is to integrate those two companies and basically make the biggest, baddest podcasting, hosting and audio management company that we can with ad insertion tech. Some cool stuff around the corner. So I'm excited.
Now, since we last spoke, you've literally been all over the world chasing the increasing number of podcast conferences. So we want to pick your brain on the key takeaways. But first, where have you been?
Oh, man, I have been a few places. There's been some audio conferences in Sydney, Vegas, London. I've been in Montreal for a while. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff happening around the world with audio. So I just go where they send me now.
Globetrotting.
Yeah. I have a boss now and he tells me to get on a plane and I get on the plane and then I go and I talk and I listen and I come back.
Amazing.
It's fun.
I love it.
Now, your most recent stop was Podcast Day in London.
Yes, put on by the Radio Days Europe team. They do a great job every year of doing Podcast Day.
And so I saw a social media post by Andrew Davies, who's from ABC Audio Studios Australia, that was all about discoverability and what motivates listeners to try a new podcast. And I was quite surprised by the figures. But can you talk us through them?
Yeah, sure. So Andrew feels very strongly about how to get listeners into podcasting based on the episode description. And whilst it's a relatively unsexy topic by his own admission, it is really important to land that episode title, to make it punchy, to figure out what people are going to pick up and listen to. And so he had a really interesting slide that is available on the Twitters about what motivates listeners to try a new podcast. And out of the research that he was presenting on from ABC, 73% of people decide whether to listen to a podcast episode based on the description. And I think when you think about the fact that when you look at your phone, most podcast apps, regardless of what you use, show the first 3 lines at most, I completely agree. That's a no-brainer. But when you see it in that way, it's more important than recommendations, which are at 72%. The host comprises 50% of what motivates people to listen to a new podcast. And then obviously coming down from that, 21% of it is if it's a recognised brand, and only 8% of it is the artwork.
We talk about artwork being important a lot, and I was surprised to see that was so low. The host at 50% makes sense. We talk about the host and the rapport with the host being really important. What's not mentioned here is the name of the podcast, or is that kind of bundled up in description?
Yeah, I think it's bundled up in the description, and I would say that the artwork, depending on what people think of the artwork, the artwork is really important to get featured on your Pocket Casts and your Apple Podcasts and those kind of things, so it's definitely critical. But for listeners, apparently, they're looking at what the title is. And, so I know myself, I'm now at a level of podcast consumption that I look at my episodes per day, and what I'm looking at in terms of what they're talking about is more important. Like, I know that Today Explained is going to be a good hard-hitting podcast, but I only have so many hours in the day, and so I want to look at the show as opposed to the podcast series.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as podcast proliferates, more and more and more people are listening, if that changes. It makes sense then that people who are listening more, as you say, are used to what they're listening to. They know exactly what kind of podcast they're listening to, therefore the artwork is irrelevant.
Yeah. So I think the challenge for brands entering the space then is doing both. Like, not only do they have to capture the eye of people that maybe haven't seen their podcast before, but they also need to make the description snappy, because you really kind of have to hit both markers in order to get new listening for a new show that a brand, known or unknown, has released.
Yeah, that's right. So Sharon, we spoke there more about discovering new podcasts once you're really in a podcast app, but how do you get people into their podcast apps? How do you get them to discover new podcasts?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think historically people have always just thought it's word of mouth, and I would tell you, have you heard about this new podcast? And, you kind of go from there. And then the natural extension of that has been, if you're launching a podcast, you should be paying to advertise that podcast on other people's podcasts. So do like cross promos or contra deals or whatever you need to do. But if people are already in the podcast ecosystem, you need to find them within that. We've seen some really interesting things though recently. I think the main thing that I would want to get across to people is you have to treat it like a business line, and a business line has its own P&L, it has its own budget. You need to be willing to spend, like I always talk about this Kevin Costner build it and they will come mentality. People think that is how podcasts get out there. I saw bill posters the other day for Schwartz Media and their 7am podcast. That's niche Melbourne. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, you've got to sink some money into it, absolutely. And I think you've got to be responsible for the discoverability of your own podcast. I think, there are some surveys that show that recommendation is definitely the highest of the ways that people find new podcasts. But at the end of the day, the content needs to be great, and you do need to find ways to make them discoverable.
Yep, and I think that there's technology coming up through the ranks that will help with that. So text-to-speech, speech-to-text, Google and, Apple as the bigger tech players in the industry that are building this kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting times ahead.
Word of mouth only works if you've got enough people that know about it to pass on the word too.
Yeah, I think word of mouth as well. Like, podcasting is the victim of a lot of memes, which, you're that one person at a party talking about podcasting and trying to convince your friends to get into podcasting. I would love it if we talked about podcasting as like audio documentaries or, audio stories and those kind of things. Like, I think there's probably a wider audience that can get into that when you're talking about it. But yeah, it's true. Word of mouth. What beats a friend's recommendation? How do you find Netflix shows? At parties, this is what podcasting is powerful for, because parties used to be, what are you watching on Netflix? And soon it'll be, what are you listening to on podcasts?
I guess that also then leads us into our next area, which is community building. If you've got a community around you, you trust certain people around you to make good recommendations, that's essentially building community, which is so important as part of discoverability, but building a strong, trusted listener base
100%.
For your podcast.
The champions of your podcast. So going back to Podcast Day in London, there was a presentation by Anna Noble, who is a digital editor at BBC Worldwide Services, and then John Manell as well, who also is from BBC. And they basically had this amazing presentation about how to build a community around your podcast, whether it's Facebook groups or whether it's empowering the listeners to share that content out there. And then those people become the ambassadors of your brand, of your show, and they go forth and spread the message.
Can brands do that, do you think?
100%. I think the distinction between brands is, are you making a podcast as an extension of your brand, or are you doing it to build a community of people that love your brand? And once you know which of those two paths you are, I think you can then harness the power of podcasting.
Were there any other trends or things that brands should take away from Podcast Day London?
There were some really great presentations, and I hope that they make those available. I'd probably encourage people to check out the website, which I have no idea what the URL is. Sorry, Frederick, if you're listening to this. It's like Podcast Day Europe or something like that. Just Google it. You'll find it, I promise. But there were some really interesting people talking about the gaps in content, and there were quite a number of presentations actually about how kids or youth or millennial content is the next market ready for kind of like open slather. Like, that's what people haven't yet. It's the new true crime, I suppose, is the kind of feeling that I took away from. And so I think there's some really interesting opportunities there for brands and for new podcasts to get involved in.
And there are some really good branded kids podcasts, aren't there? What are they?
Yes, I mean, Chompers by Gimlet is probably the most well-known, which was who was it done by?
Oral-B.
Oral-B, thank you. That was a test. You both passed. Congratulations. But there's kids networks out there. So in Australia we have Kindling, which is an amazing kids network. We have Fun Kids in the UK, which does some great stuff. There are opportunities for brands to get involved in either existing shows or to start their own and to think about, again, those cross-promotions. How do they get discovered? Do they already have a network of kids shows they can advertise on? That kind of stuff.
Now, moving a bit closer to home, one of your colleagues, Mitch Secrett, has written an article about the conversions between radio and podcasts, or in other words, between live versus on-demand.
Correct, yep.
It's a great article by Mitch, and I would suggest you all go give it a good read. We're not going to discuss the part that talks about radio because we're not really here to talk about the radio industry per se, but he did talk about some other really interesting stuff around podcast listening trends.
Yeah, so he had a few notes. I mean, obviously Schwartz Media is top of mind for him at the moment. They're one of our clients. And so the Daily News podcast is something that we're seeing a proliferation of. Again, going back to London Podcast Day, the head of NPR's Up First was there talking about he was the first Daily News podcast, and now there's like 7, 8, 9 of these things in the US, and I think that's going to happen here in Australia. So Mitch talked about 7am, he talked about Mamma Mia's daily podcast, The Quickie, and a lot of other people that are coming up with daily content. And I think that as it ties into what younger people are looking for, we need a new, better, faster way of finding our news content. Facebook has changed algorithms and you can no longer find the news content by scrolling, and so audio is now what we're hunting for.
So how many daily shows are there in Australia now? Do you know?
I don't actually. I mean, if you count the radio shows that are podcasting and you think about those as daily shows, and that obviously changes the numbers dramatically, there could be, 30 of those, I guess, off the top of my head. But like podcast specific, less than 5.
Really?
So it's a huge growth area.
It's
huge opportunity.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And to think about how you're going to differentiate yourself and the length versus the content versus, all those bits and pieces.
Mitch also highlighted something that we've talked about before, but that's a younger demographic are listening to podcasts in growing numbers.
Yep, it's true. So Edison does a lot of research on this in terms of where the growth market is, and younger people, I'm loath to use the term millennials, but essentially we want a better way of getting content when and where it suits us, and podcasting ticks those boxes for us.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the sale of Omny Studio was a way of sort of, I guess, ratifying that this is a real industry, and we've talked about the big transactions earlier in the year by Spotify. But ad revenue, Mitch also said in this article, is budgeted to hit, and this is for podcasting as opposed to radio, which obviously is enormous, but just podcasting ad revenue is going to hit $1 billion in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so PwC came out with their Global Media Trends Outlook, and that's what they're forecasting. There's a few of us in the industry that think it's going to be even more than that. Like, it's based on self-reported as a mix of the numbers. $1 billion would be amazing, don't get me wrong. Like, let's all jump into that money pit and have a great swim around. But yeah, I think the time now has passed that people are testing the water. Is there money in podcasting is now answered. It is how much money can we get out of it, and it is when do we start seeing the shift away from traditional medium into podcasting. And Omny's always been really different in our mindset here because we don't believe in cannibalising older traditional markets. Like, we think they can be used hand in hand, which is what Mitch's article was also alluding to. But there is money on the table in new markets, and podcasting is one of them.
So really, at this point, brands don't need to be as worried and as conservative perhaps as they are about putting some money into this podcasting medium. It's bearing fruit. It's on an upward trend, and they just need to be a little bit brave and dive in.
And we talked last episode about the 700 and something thousand podcasts that are out there, and some brands might be thinking, oh, is it too late? Have I missed the boat? But
no,
it's not.
No. And it
Still
will,
early days.
And it will reap dividends in the end. Yeah.
Mitch also referred to listening to audio in the car.
Correct.
And predominantly it's the radio, because you get in the car and you switch it on and the radio is probably on. But Spotify have been trying for a while with some technology to try and change that. And I think there's a takeaway for brands here that the car is a place where audio just makes sense. And it may not necessarily be the podcasts that are being produced right now, but audio content on demand in the car is definitely a huge space to keep an eye on.
Huge. I mean, CarPlay obviously came out. I think the one thing to remember when you're talking about the car environment is how quickly people swap cars as opposed to phones or computers or other pieces of technology in their lives. And when I say pieces of technology, like ways they can listen to audio. And so the revolving door of people changing out their cars and the new technology coming into cars is a much slower slide, but it is a slide that's happening, like the fact that people are talking about it in our industry. So you have to think about the way that the car works and why radio wins in the car is because that frictionless turn it on, it works kind of thing. Cables connecting your phone into the car haven't changed that dramatically, but what are brands going to do to leverage the car time? You know, and so who should they be talking to? What partnerships are they be getting in place? What content based on the length of a commute as well, I think is really important to think about.
And I think what Spotify is doing is really interesting. They're kind of testing what they're calling the car thing, in inverted commas, testing voice-controlled smart assistant for cars. So they're learning about people's habits, and then they've already put together a playlist which is full of podcast news, music, etc. So it is that just one-button, frictionless.
Spotify want to be radio in the car. They just want it to be a different type of radio.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the other thing too is that habits outside of the car are being brought into the car, so that if you are a big podcast listener outside, you are going to bring that in. I find that even with myself. I start listening to my podcast in my car, and radio's probably a bit down, but radio certainly is king in the car, no question.
Well, and Google keep talking about all the things they're doing. I don't know, Sharon, whether you've got any other insights into what they're doing with AI and other things, but
I think that Google are trying to create a more seamless way of experiencing audio across all of your devices and the environment that you're in. And I was a little dismissive of Google when they first launched. I was like, how are they going to create this experience? But if you think about all the touch points they have in your life, and I think they're starting to see that atomized content, like listening to a podcast on a smart speaker, if you only have 10 minutes to kill, is not going to be the greatest experience. I think they're figuring that out. I think they're looking at smart speaker usage reports and the like and seeing where the opportunities are, and that's what we all should be doing as well as content creators and brands.
So staying on the topic of smart speakers, Sharon, I just want to draw your attention to a smart speaker report by NPR and Edison Research. 21% of Americans 18 and over own a smart speaker, or around 53 million people.
It's pretty crazy.
Pretty crazy. 14 million new smart speaker owners in 2018 and 78% growth in ownership from 2017 to 2018.
That's nuts. Like, that's crazy.
It's
and
insane.
Still so much room to grow, which is why I think people link podcasting and smart speakers, because the podcasting statistics are really similar, which is a lot of people listen to podcasts, a lot of people have smart speakers, but the room for growth is still so much
massive. Particularly when, and this is a really interesting point, 69% of smart speaker owners agree they don't know enough about their smart speaker to use all of its features.
And I think you launch a skill, or you launch, you put your content on there, and again, Kevin Costner-wise, they'll just know to ask, how do you know to ask your smart speaker to play a certain show or to do a certain action? You don't. And all these, skills that brands are launching, how do you then communicate that out to your community?
Yeah. And these people are jumping on a trend, which is great, and great for podcasters, because then there's the opportunity to grab them where they're listening.
Yeah.
Grab them where
and it's the same as the car, right? Like, you do what you're used to doing.
Yeah.
As you've been brought up. So, like, the report went through the top 10 weekly smart speaker requests, and it's things like play music, get the weather, ask the news, those types of things. Nick and I were talking earlier, and the way that I engage with a speaker in my house, I instantly think about it as background noise. And so I'll walk through my door and continue with my earpods with my podcast, but I won't make the link to play that on a smart speaker.
Yeah.
But going back to the younger generation that's coming into things, this is also a generation that's growing up with robots in their house for the first time, and their interaction with audio on a smart speaker will be much different to, like, Nick and my usage.
Yeah, well, the survey said that 75% of smart speaker owners with kids use their device daily. So kids are listening, whether they like it or not. They don't get a choice. They're listening.
Hey Siri, entertain my child.
That's right. And that's why the growth space for kids and the younger demographic is so ripe for disruption.
Yep.
And James Cridland would say that podcasting in its current form is not for smart speakers, but the opportunity for brands
Yes.
Correct.
to be involved
That's
with
right.
audio on smart speakers is 100% an opportunity.
100%. It's just a way of not thinking about podcasting as long-form content.
Yeah.
Think about podcasting and your brand and the content that you want people to find on each of the devices and in each of the different environments and tailor it for it.
Now, to finish, Sharon, there's been some announcements from our good friends at Apple.
There have, yep. There have been some exciting things. They recently had their WWDC conference and they put podcasting semi-front and centre again, which was really good to see. I think we can all agree. And they've been talking about category changes, which I suppose for our core listeners, for their brand, is very exciting. Something ridiculous, like 70 new categories or something about to be foraged up so they can pick more than just true crime or business. And so you can actually hit your niche target market now. And that'll be fun. It should roll out in the next little while.
They're going to have a new dedicated app for podcasts on the dock on a Mac.
Oh, yes. Yeah, which is going to be really good. So they're obviously splitting out the media channels.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit of I won't say pessimist in this. This is a positive side effect for podcasting. They didn't do this for podcasting. They did this to split video out and make it a first-class citizen, and that's where their money's going to get made, in my opinion. Podcasting gets the benefit, though, of being split out, and that, I think, will help with discovery. That'll help with solidification in the space as well.
And prime real estate on all new Macs, just on the dock there.
Correct.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and on the new versions of iOS, it's going to be on the front screen. So it's just, that visibility for a lot of people. For that, 49% of people that still don't know what a podcast is, it's going to be in front of them, and that's encouraging the non-believers to
Yeah, I mean,
get
Apple
involved.
is responsible for the growth that we've had to date in podcasting, like the fact that it was pre-installed. When Google entered the space, a lot of people thought that that was going to be the next opening of the market because they would pre-install an app as well. Google's taken a little bit of a different tack with it, which I think is also going to bear fruit, but in a different way. But Apple doing this is really definitely solidifying what they've done from 2006 onwards.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us today.
Thanks,
Okay,
Sharon.
go get another plane and see where they send me next, and then I'll report back again.
We look forward to it. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
And for more about us and how we can help you use audio content to build engagement, you can go to be.com.au. From all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.